On July 27, 1981, one of the most important deals in the history of personal computing was finally completed after about 6 months of it being in the works. Microsoft, an aptly named software manufacturer who, in conjunction with IBM, needed an operating system for an unimportant line of machines they were working on, and one that had just over 200 employees at the time, had just purchased the full rights to a CP/M clone by a Tukwila hardware manufacturer, ironically named Seattle Computer Products, for $50,000. Microsoft had previously purchased a non-exclusive license to 86DOS in January, but did not completely buy it outright until July. IBM PC-DOS, as it became known, shipped with the original IBM PC line of computers in August, yet just over a year later, Microsoft were trying to replace it. The metaphor of a desktop with objects that could be opened with Windows was first envisioned by PARC, a division of Xerox, in 1970, and was first experimented with in Xerox's Alto machine in 1973. While not quite what you see in today's machines, you can kind of see the basic roots of it, an interface controlled by a mouse that has clickable files and menus. This is best seen in the Alto's file manager, the Neptune directory editor. It has one portion of the screen for the current directory listing, another for a future directory that you may want to copy files into, and clickable start, quit, clear, and type buttons. The Alto was capable of running Smalltalk, an object-oriented environment, which is much closer to what we think of today as a desktop environment with overlapping windows featuring applications. It's a common myth that Apple had the idea for the Macintosh and Lisa after they took a tour of PARC and saw the Alto. While they did take a tour of PARC and see the Alto, they had come up with Project Annie, a project with the same underlying mechanics of just an easier Apple II back in 1978, and this turned into the Macintosh later on. What they did come back with from PARC was their ideas for a graphical interface in the fall of 1979. At the same time as the Macintosh was being developed, there was also the Lisa, which at the time was very similar to the Apple II in its display and interface, in that it was just a green monochrome CRT with a text mode interface. It took Macintosh project leader Jeff Raskin essentially being like, hey, look at what we're doing on the Macintosh, this is what we should be doing, for Ken Rothmuller, leader of the Lisa project at the time, to change it to bitmap graphics. As Raskin puts it in Making the Macintosh, the basic idea of a graphics-based user interface-oriented machine for Lisa came from the Macintosh project. The only book I've ever seen that mentions that is Owen Linsmeyer's Apple Confidential. Everyone else has gotten it wrong. They say that the Macintosh was a downsized Lisa, when really the Lisa was an upsized Macintosh. Exactly backwards. It's worth noting that at this point in development, both the Macintosh and Lisa projects were very codependent on each other. They were always borrowing things from each other, software was being developed for one system and then being moved over to the other, but the Macintosh couldn't quite stand up on its own without the Lisa. We were using the Lisa as the development machine for writing software for Macintosh, and we hadn't yet reached the point where the Macintosh could run standalone. The Macintosh needed to be hooked up to a Lisa in order to download software from it. The two interfaces were also essentially siphoning whatever was going on at Xerox at the time. Not helping at all was the Star, which Xerox started selling commercially in April 1981. However, PARC would frequently publicly showcase the technology, even on the Alto during development, which in the Star's case started back in 1977. Apple had gotten enough people over from PARC to work on the Lisa project to the point where they weren't completely ripping them off, just borrowing essentially everyone involved so that they could definitely not rip off the Star. By the beginning of 1981, the interfaces were starting to take shape, and by shape, I mean the shape of Smalltalk, and this is about when Apple got Microsoft to come down and look at the Macintosh. Now, if you remember from the beginning of the video, I called Microsoft a software manufacturer, and by all means they still are, but at the time, they didn't have their own system or hardware to publish software for, so they made software for other companies. Apple had licensed Microsoft's BASIC for the Apple II, they had already worked with one another, so Microsoft was one of the obvious choices for a demonstration as they were planning on launching the Macintosh in the fall of 1982. At this demonstration, Microsoft had to make a promise to not launch anything that involved the mouse until a year after the Macintosh's launch. They also were not allowed to see anything related to the Lisa, only the Macintosh. However, the Macintosh had to be connected to the Lisa to even work, so they had to have the Lisa in the other room. "What kind of hardware do you use to draw the cursor?" asked Bill Gates. "We don't have any special hardware for it. In fact..."
Shut up!
This was the voice of Steve Jobs, who was committed to the secrecy of the technology of the Macintosh and Elisa, as there was already worry that Microsoft would try and do something similar. In fact, doing it in software is better anyway, is what Andy Hertzfeld, one of the designers on the Macintosh system software, had to make up after Jobs' berating. This did not stop Microsoft from making an interface of their own. Not to be its own thing, but to house other applications. Microsoft's apps division was working on both Word and the multi-plan spreadsheet at the time for DOS, and so they developed Mush, the Microsoft user shell, also known as Interface Manager. This was essentially made as a shared library, so they didn't have to write different interfaces for every single productivity application they were making at the time. They could just have them all running under the Interface Manager. The interface consisted of the actual application and then a command strip at the bottom of the screen, housing several menus. This interface was actually used in the released versions of Word and Multiplan, both released in 1983. At the very beginning of 1982, Microsoft had gotten the main developer of the GKS, an early standard for low-level graphics which was still in development and not put into place yet, to work on graphical applications so that they could say their software was compliant with it right from the get-go. This resulted in an effort known as the GDI, or Graphics Device Independence, later the Graphics Device Interface. While the GKS was initially developed for vector graphics, GDI worked with both vector and rasterized graphics. The rasterized graphics were done on the machine, and then the output would be done in vector via a plotter. In what was likely the spring of 1983, it was decided to merge the Interface Manager and GDI teams into one, likely in an effort to make a library with the same goals as the Interface Manager, but with GDI on top of it. However, after realizing how intensive this by itself already was on top of DOS, they decided to hire Scott McGregor, the developer behind the Cedar windowing system at Park, who eventually turned it into its own operating environment. This is where I think I need to budge in by saying an operating environment is not the same as an operating system. An operating environment essentially runs on top of another system and is able to run its own applications. Before Windows 95, Windows was not an operating system, but rather an operating environment. This new environment was called Window Manager. The underlying team was composed of three major teams: the graphics team, led by Marlon Eller, the systems team, led by Steve Wood, and the user team, led by Raul Ramala. By September, Microsoft had a demo disc set up in order to show to Byte magazine, images from which they later ran in their December issue. However, even before then, the environment had been renamed Windows, which is what they ran with when it was formally announced on November 10th at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, following a set of press kits sent out to various publications featuring a squeegee and washcloth. Because Windows. The product was set to ship in April 1984 with a retail price of $100. Press photos sent out the day of announcement show a drastic overhaul over September's Window Manager demo, with a new interface much more reminiscent of McGregor's previous work with Cedar. In fact, it's basically the exact same as Cedar. Both have tiled windows, iconized applications at the bottom of the screen, a message bar at the top of the screen, menu bars for each application, and a set of windowing options that appears when you hover your mouse over the title bar. Where Windows differed from Cedar was in its apps. This early build from November 20th shows two apps that would make it into the final version of Windows, the Calendar and Clock. Also shown are Text, an early version of Notepad, Art, an early version of Paint, Spreadsheet, essentially multi-plan for Windows, and an extremely early version of the MS-DOS Executive Windows 1 shell, at this time just titled MS-DOS. It may look like a regular DOS prompt, but this controls the entire system and has special commands compared to regular DOS. This is when Apple came knocking. Get Gates down here immediately. He needs to explain this and it better be good. I want him in this room by tomorrow afternoon or else. And sure enough, the next afternoon, Gates was met at a meeting with 10 Apple employees and a very angry Jobs. You're ripping us off! I trusted you and now you're stealing from us! Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, Microsoft made a deal with Apple to not ship any piece of software using the mouse until a year after the Macintosh's set release date, which at the time was the fall of 1982, and it was now the fall of 1983, so Apple didn't have much ground here. This must have gotten Microsoft to test their limits with regards to copying Apple, as by February 1984 they had added a trash can to Windows that you would drag files to delete them, just like in the Macintosh. April 1984, the intended release date for Windows, came and went with no product. However, in May, Microsoft began shipping out a series of beta releases for developers. The first of these, compiled May 29th, contains several new apps, being Boxes, Calculator, Clipboard, Cursor Routines, Puzzle, Reversey, and Sample, while the calendar seems to be gone. The MS-DOS app has been overhauled, now being called the DOS window and having a clickable menu for different floppy drives. The view of files in the DOS window also reveals that Windows applications at this time are stored in .mod files with accompanying .res files for resources as opposed to .exe files. The second developer release, compiled in June, seems to have removed the clipboard for some reason and has centered the text on the buttons in the calculator. Other than that, there's not much difference. The third developer release, compiled in July, adds the calendar and clipboard applications back and removes the message bar at the top of the screen. The fourth developer release, compiled on August 31st, is probably the most significant out of all of these releases, adding a cooperative multitasking scheduler, a resource compiler, an Atom manager, rewritten dialog box code which allows them to overlap on top of other windows, a user profile manager, user.pro, where you can add apps to open on startup, a new font format in the form of .font files, a file viewer, the control panel, an icon editor, and Notepad. The MS-DOS Executive is also finally called the MS-DOS Executive. Now, after the project's second delay so far, is when we can finally get to some builds that we have our hands on. The fifth development release of Windows was compiled on October 31st and leaked online on September 19th, 2008. The system requirements of this release are laid out as an IBM XT or AT machine, 512 kilobytes of memory, a floppy disk configured to drive A hard disk configured to drive C, a color graphics card, an external console connected to the COM1 port for debugging, a Microsoft serial or bus mouse, a timer, and MS-DOS 2 or 3. The setup file needs to be on the root of the C drive to work, and it's just a simple batch file that copies files to the appropriate directories. The system comes on 3 floppy disks. To start the system up, you need to change the path to the Windows bin directory, then change into the Windows test directory, and then run mswin. The way the system actually starts up is by running the mswin batch file, which then loads the kernel via kernel.exe. This build adds a new executable format, changing from .mod to .exe like in DOS, though Windows applications won't run on DOS. Memory management was also completely rewritten, as the last release used a very large amount of memory when handling a lot of applications at once. Display and mouse drivers have been overhauled, being stored in .din and .sin files during setup, and copied to display.exe and cursor.exe respectively. You can change display drivers by exiting Windows and running drivers.bat, followed by either IBM Color for CGA or Hercules for, well, Hercules. Since the previous release, several new cursors as well as chart, graph, 2 push-pull demos, and template have been added. If you hold Shift while opening an app, it will run iconized in the bottom of the screen. This is also one of 2 available builds where you can drag and drop files from one directory to another, so that's neat. The icon for Sample is also the Superman logo. One really cool thing that happens with Notepad is that there's a chance that it just won't work, and also alongside Clipboard and the control panel, you can't run more than one instance of it. You also can't close the clipboard as it's an important system file, and you can't close ppdemo.exe either or the system will hang. Say goodbye to trying to access an empty floppy disk, as that will also crash the system. By early 1985, the general consensus within the company is that Windows wasn't quite going where they wanted it to go. The project was delayed once again the previous December, and there were doubts that it would even ship, gaining the fabled vaporware status that only the worst of the worst could ever dream of, not to mention the failure of the company's attempts to license the product to IBM. At least 4 product managers were burnt through before finally settling on Tandy Trower, former manager of Microsoft Basic, on the advice of one Steve Ballmer. Microsoft's 30th employee and marketing manager, he would soon take over the Windows project as a whole once McGregor left the company. The fruits of Trower and Ballmer's efforts ultimately ended in a completely rewritten system using lots of code taken directly from the ongoing multitasking DOS project, which is a subject for another video. The alpha release, compiled on January 31st, 1985, is still installed with a batch file now called wininst.bat, though it now takes 4 disks as opposed to 3. Another difference is that after your files are done copying, setup now takes you to a new screen, install.exe, that asks you to select your graphics card, including newly added EGA support, and then creates the win100.exe file, which contains drivers and core system components. Starting up the system, you'll notice that it's now run using win.exe. This is known as fast boot, with slow boot being achieved by just running kernel. The API has been drastically overhauled alongside the executable format, rendering applications from any prior build unusable. This build also contains support for cooperative MS-DOS applications, which means that they run inside of Windows, with uncooperative applications just exiting Windows to run. Alongside DOS app support comes support for their accompanying .pif files, which ensure that they run properly under Windows. This build includes a few new applications, being Cube, Font Demo, Map Modes, and Paint. Paint was seemingly deleted off the second installation disk for some reason, though it is recoverable. It's worth noting that by this time, work had begun in a word processor for Windows based on Word called Windows Write. Though it didn't make it into the beta release sent out to developers in May, even soliciting a not very positive reaction from the applications group at the time, progress was still happening. The beta release was originally slated to be out in March, then April 15th, then April 22nd, and eventually May 8th when it was finally compiled. This build contains a completely redesigned installer, setup.exe, featuring text-based graphical elements. Finishing setup and booting up the system, you can see that a new boot screen has been introduced in a style similar to other Microsoft apps at the time, and even in color, a first for Windows so far. It's worth noting that earlier builds did have color support in their code, though they don't actually support any graphics cards that could employ it. The interface is mostly finalized in this build. The calendar is back, albeit with a very simple one which overlaps. The calendar in this build is merely just a pop-up window, which is why it can overlap like this. Redesigned versions of the calculator, control panel, and paint are here through Trower's advice after seeing Lotus's Metro and Borland's Sidekick suites, and new apps are here such as Boxes, Card File, Palette, and Spectrum. This build also introduces about dialogues for apps, though branding is inconsistent and they can at times be very buggy. Looking at win.ini, you can see that .trm files are associated with the terminal application, which was still in development at the time and wasn't included in this build. Overall, it appears like this release was rushed out to meet demands after being delayed numerous times, and the same goes for the rest of the project, really. The vaporware accusations were only growing bigger with time. The current June 28, 1985 release date for the project was only coming quicker, and it wasn't even close to being ready, with developers only getting another beta release on that date. So in July, Ballmer suggested they send out what Trower dubbed the Premiere Edition in order to technically fulfill the summer release date while also sending out a preliminary release for feedback. The only notable differences between this and the beta are the finalized calendar and a slightly recolored calculator. Just as the team thought that the project was getting close to being final, the person behind the system's memory management noticed a fatal flaw in that it needed to be rewritten. This led to the project's fourth delay to date, and though Trower tried to find a way around it, they had to go through and rewrite the memory management code at the 11th hour. In September, CompuData, later Tulip, shipped out a nearly final version of Windows with their Tulip PC System series of computers, versions 1.xx and 1.xy, likely out of frustration due to Microsoft's apparent inability to ship the product. This is the first known build to have a default color scheme as opposed to monochrome like in previous builds, despite a few of them having color support. This build is also the first to contain the credits Easter egg seen in the final version. This version only has 20 names and refers to itself as the secret list. Later that month, a later build was included in the runtime of Micrographics' Inavision drawing software. Throughout October, various retail beta releases were sent out before finally completing testing and deciding on a build to release on November 15th. Windows 1.01 released to stores on November 20th, 1985. Windows 1 was billed mostly as a solution for software manufacturers to have a windowing system attached to their software, which in a way was the primary usage of it. Not too many people actually used Windows as their primary environment, with many criticizing it for its high system requirements of 256 kilobytes of memory, automatically ruling it out for IBM PC users, as well as its dependence on the mouse, a fairly unadopted technology at the time, but a lot of application vendors used it as the runtime for their apps. Windows 1 sold about 500,000 copies from 1985 to 1987, which proved it popular enough for future updates for OEMs. Plans for a successor to Windows 1 began before it even came out. Meeting notes from April 1985 mentioned Windows 1.1 as having a set release date in the third quarter of 1985 and being simply a bug fix release. By late 1985, the focus of the project shifted to utilizing the new Intel i386 processor, specifically its virtual 8086 mode, allowing preemptive multitasking within DOS applications in protected mode, and its memory addressing using EMS emulation to allow the system to use memory in the upper memory area, usually the upper 384 kilobytes of the available 1 megabyte of real mode addressable memory. Meanwhile, Hewlett-Packard, or HP, had developed a version of Windows that allowed usage of the high memory area on the 286 on systems with more than 640 kilobytes, meaning that it could use the 64 kilobytes above the typical 1 megabyte ceiling in real mode. HP would license this code to Microsoft, resulting in there essentially being two Windows products: Windows 386 for the 386 and just Windows for everything else. Development for what was now known as Windows 1.5 started in around the spring of 1986. On top of the existing Windows team who had been in charge of Windows 1, a new team was made for Windows 1.5, led by Neil Konzen, and a Windows 386 team was made. Some of the main focuses during development were overlapping windows, rewriting several parts of the kernel and API in C as opposed to assembly or even vice versa, and the previously mentioned 386 and 286 optimizations. In early 1987, after they'd missed their initial release date, the product was renamed Windows 2, likely because of the largely overhauled system. Two alpha and beta releases were sent out in June and July respectively, before Windows 386 2.01 was released on the Compact Desk Pro 386 system in September. The most obvious differences between this and Windows 1 are the updated setup, new Microsoft logo in the boot screen, the system now having out-of-the-box support for VGA graphics, and the new color scheme. Other than that, there aren't that many over-the-hood differences besides what I mentioned earlier. Windows 286 was lagging behind at this time, likely due to contractual obligations with Compaq, ensuring Windows 386 launched with their own 386 machine, though it did eventually ship in October as Windows 2.02 after at least 4 beta releases. Windows 2.03 was the first widely released version, released in December. This version adds support for PS2 mice. Windows 286 2.1, released in May 1988, was the first version to bear the Windows 286 branding, and the first to run memset during setup, which installs the Smart Drive disk caching program, storing frequently accessed data in memory. Windows 2.11, released in March 1989, was the final version of Windows 2, which adds support for the AppleTalk network protocol. Windows 2 was seen as a massive improvement over its predecessor, though overall reception was still mixed. Around 2 million copies were sold by January 1990, causing lots more applications to be developed, including the first Windows versions of Word and Excel. However, with said recognition comes scrutiny as well. Apple strikes again, and after seeing Windows 2's overlapping windows, they were pissed. Apple had licensed a few user interface elements from the Macintosh and Lisa for Windows 1, though when Microsoft changed some of these elements for Windows 2, they filed a lawsuit for copyright infringement. This case wouldn't be settled until 1994, when a judge decided that out of the 189 interface elements that Apple had filed suit for, 179 of them had been licensed to Microsoft, and the other 10 were not copyrightable. Which is fitting because partway through the case, Xerox sued Apple for copying their Alto and Star design elements in the Macintosh and Lisa, mainly to prove a point that Xerox were the true minds behind these interfaces. They say what comes around goes around, and for Apple, this certainly happened. They were extremely defensive over interface elements that weren't theirs to begin with, starting during Windows 1's development, and it eventually came back and bit them in the butt. I think the moral of the story here is that everyone steals from each other, and that's okay. Nothing is truly original.